Social activist Ndileka Mandela says South Africa needs to be reconciled again. She says this could be achieved through a new kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Speaking at an event in the Eastern Cape, she said the first TRC did not cater for the needs of the new generation. But 24 years after democracy, why hasn't South Africa reconciled with its past? And are issues of inequality and land stumbling blocks? Well, Wits School of Governance professor Ivor Sarakinsky is here with me, and the Social Justice Coalition's head of programs, Musa Gwebani, joins us from our Cape Town studios to discuss this. Perhaps to just get us going, let's listen, if we could, to some of what Ndileka Mandela had to say.
I feel that we need to on the second round of reconciliation, of a TRC, so to speak, because if you look at the first TRC, it did the first repair, which was first generation. We're now second generation type of anger. So we need to maybe go through 2, 3, 4, 5 reconciliation to be able to go through an entire generation, because people that were young at the first TRC are now adults and they've grown up with that anger, and we need to let go and maybe 2 or 3 more TRC to be able to heal as a nation.
Well, Ndileka Mandela speaking there at an event to mark National Reconciliation Day. Perhaps if I may start with you, Ivor. What did the TRC do for South Africa? I think that would be an obvious starting point to put things into context.
It paved the way for democracy in terms of addressing a whole range of serious obstacles that would have hindered the movement towards a democratic process. And it achieved that imperfectly under the conditions. One isn't going to get perfection, but I don't think we should underestimate the importance of it in putting things in the public domain which enabled everyone to say, we have a stake in this new political system that is emerging.
Musa, what for you did the TRC do for our country?
I think the TRC really as a point of departure was important. And in terms of moving us forward into the kind of country that we had envisioned at the time. The failures of the TRC, however, are quite disappointing, but for its time and for its purpose, it was necessary and it was effective for the role that it had to play in transitioning South Africa from an apartheid state to the democratic state. However, there are contestations around, could there have been more that the TRC could have done? And perhaps we'll be able to talk about that later.
Well, let's talk about what you regard as having been the failures of that process, as you say.
So there is maybe a public misconception around what is the role of commissions, really? And now South Africa has been littered with commissions. And that commissions in and of themselves, although they take what looks like a quasi-judicial way of investigation, they really do lie in the executive. And when you have a weak executive that is unable to effect the findings or the recommendations of a commission, that commission might as well have never sat. And that's what we saw with the TRC. So 300 perpetrators that had been recommended for prosecution were never prosecuted. And that's not necessarily a failure of the TRC per se, but a failure on the executive to execute those recommendations. And that's what, and the reparations as well that had been recommended by the TRC that had never actually been affected nor got to the people that needed to have them. And so we see that the TRC really lacks a very important leg of transitional justice, which is justice. And that really the victims really saw no justice, and it was very perpetrator-sided. It was there to ease white guilt. It was there to make white people more secure that no one was going to kill them, that there'd be no war. But really for the victims of apartheid, there was very little that that commission was able to give them, partly because of the way in which it was structured with its very perpetrator center, and partly because the executive then failed to execute the recommendations made by the Commission.
Ivor, were we let down by members of the executive who could have taken things forward or done more, as Musa suggests, notwithstanding the inherent limitations that a commission of inquiry can have?
Of course, but one has to separate that from the TRC in itself. The giving voice to oppressed people who'd lost loved ones and allowing that voice to be ventilated through that process, it played a crucial role in setting an example on how these past injustices can be dealt with individually and socially. And it wasn't just about perpetrators. And some prosecutions did take place. They were badly pursued. But that's not the TRC's fault. The Magnus Malan case comes to mind immediately. So did the executive fail the transitional society at the time? Perhaps. But let's look at it logically. You've got enormous pressures, a new government, people who don't have experience in public office, suddenly in public office, suddenly having to make decisions, suddenly having to work with budgets and processes and rules and regulations that they weren't familiar with at all. And then you start to prioritize and you try and deal with stuff. And you're going to get some things right, you're going to get some things wrong. So I think...
Why was it because they were just overwhelmed, or was it because, as some people have asserted, there was just no political will to actually go further than they did?
No, I think that if one puts oneself in the seat of a minister, of the president, of an official in this new administration which comes into office straight after the first democratic election, how do you prioritize the things you've got to do? Everyone's saying we need stuff to be done. How do you work out a program that's going to make everyone happy? You're not going to be able to do that. Some people will get some of what they want, others will get less of that what they want. You try and give everyone a bit of what they want as you take the society forward. There'll be winners and losers in those compromises, those pragmatic, tough choices that decision makers had to make. And I think that we've got to look at it from their perspective, as opposed to, with hindsight, where we are now, look backwards and say they should have done this, they should have done that. It's very easy with hindsight 2020 vision.
Musa, what do you ascribe those failures of the executive to?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
What do you ascribe the failures you've alluded to of the executive? In other words, what do you believe made cabinet ministers who were responsible for a whole range of portfolios? What do you think was responsible for them not going far enough?
I mean, part of the magnitude of the work that the TRC was dealing with, it was quite a voluminous piece of work, and it stretched over a number of years. And it was very easy, perhaps, to make it seem like it was not an urgent issue, because it went on for as long as it did. But I must say that I'm really struggling to accept that the government was simply overwhelmed. And so, because it was overwhelmed with running a new country, we allowed so many people's experiences to go unheard. And we're allowed for so many things to fall in between the cracks. That for me is every single government is overwhelmed. There's no government in the world that has an easy job. Being overwhelmed is really, for me, that's just not good enough. And I think there was a lack of political will. And also, just that our government didn't want to stir, to sort of stir the waters, because we had to create peace on the basis of quietening black pain. And I think for me that seems to be it, that black people had to pretend like it wasn't as bad as it was, and so no persecutions or prosecutions could happen out of it, in order for us to sustain peace, but really there was no justice that came out of that process.
Ivor, what could they have done? Let's say, even with the benefit of a hindsight, what could they have done, though?
Yeah.
Beyond what they have been able to do.
What the executive could have done, perhaps was to take the recommendations of the TRC seriously, particularly when it pertained to reparations. Because that was something the executive could have affected, and what we see then, and what that executive had done in very bad expenditure, they could have invested in reparations from the onset. And secondly, I think the TRC, even within its terms of reference, could have required remorse as a requirement for amnesty, which it wasn't. And the TRC, what then it did is that it had a very weird understanding of Ubuntu and how Ubuntu works. And that when people simply say what they did without asking for forgiveness, without an acknowledgement that they would have done something differently, without being remorseful, that they could get amnesty. And for me, that very perpetrator-sided part of the TRC was problematic. And also, I feel like the TRC, there was this view that black people were equally responsible for apartheid, and that there was wrong on both sides, and both those wrongs could be equally weighted, which isn't correct. And people who had been responding to an apartheid state which was violent were treated equally to people who had been working for that state. And Mama Winnie comes up at the fore of my mind, that she was reacting to a state of violence, and so she can't be equally tried with the cock.
Okay. Now, Ivor, Musa, tell me, where do we go from here?
I think where we go from here, if we were to initiate a similar process, it's very important for all of us to come to the table of reconciliation. I think there's something quite perverse in expecting people who had been the victims of apartheid to also be the ones initiating reconciliatory processes without the people who actually benefited and had institutionalized apartheid. So I think that's the one thing. And I think in our conversation about reconciliation, there must be real and tangible justice. And the land question, which is at the heart of justice in this country, and at the heart of every single act of resistance, first by the Khoi in the 1600s, and right up to the end of apartheid, everybody has been resisting and fighting for land. And I think land justice then becomes central to the conversation around reconciliation and shaping a new South Africa in which all of us can participate in.
Now, we now have this day that is called the National Day of Reconciliation. With that background, or with what you believe are the things that need to be done, what form and shape should national reconciliation then take? From where you sit, obviously.
I think... Is this question to me?
Sorry. Yes, to you, yes. Musa?
Oh, okay. So what should National Reconciliation Day be? I'm also a bit aggrieved about National Reconciliation Day, which also happens on MK Day. And I think there's a bit of a... I feel like MK Day should also feature in our reconciliation conversations, particularly around why MK was necessary for it to start. But I think also that our National Reconciliation Day should be about bringing people together and sitting in a single table of conversation. And I feel like these efforts should come from everyone. The reconciliation agenda has been overburdened with black people who are also the victims of apartheid. I'd like to see a National Reconciliation Day similar, for instance, to what happens in Australia with the National Sorry Day, where people who continue to benefit out of systems of oppression acknowledge it and come to the people that are aggrieved by it as to what are some of the ways that we can effect justice? What are some of the ways that we can continue to live together? What about the way that I continue to exist, which is a privileged existence, should I be letting go of in order for us to have a better, more united country?
Now, if you sat in a table, of course, with people who hold different views from the views that you particularly hold, say you are part of that conversation, sitting around that table with people who don't believe in the things that you believe in, what would you, one, say is what are the things that they need to do, and what would you then be prepared to let go of?
I think there must be an acknowledgement of privilege. There must be an acknowledgement of, particularly from white South Africans, which is lacking, that the way that I exist and the privilege that I accrue and the opportunities that I have, I directly derive from apartheid. And I think that conversation is missing, and I think that admission is very necessary. And then there has to be an additional leg of understanding that that needs reparations. People are still paying Holocaust reparations it's now going to be close to half a century since the genocide had occurred. And for us to be able to then have a very real way of speaking to the people whose lives continue to be disadvantaged because of apartheid. I'd like that to look in the form of apartheid reparations. And there was a very interesting conversation that had been going on a few years ago around businesses that had operated during apartheid, that had benefited from cheap labor of black people, who then later on made millions to pay apartheid reparations. So I'm interested in having conversations like that will seek to effect real and tangible justice for ordinary people, as opposed to a kumbaya and hug it out.
But of course, I mean, we also have to acknowledge that as recent or the last few years have actually shown us, among our own people, there are things that we never thought some of them could possibly do. They have in very significant ways. There are people who have actually shown us that it is not enough to rely on who we thought we were or the sort of things that drove people to struggle against apartheid. I'm sure you are prepared to concede on that as well.
Precisely. I mean, I think what's important is the truth, and for everyone to hold themselves accountable for their end of the deal. And I think a dishonest conversation which seeks to create perpetual victims and perpetual perpetrators is disingenuous and doesn't move us forward. And so concessions will need to be made on either side. And I do believe, and I hold this view quite strongly, that any kind of South Africa involves white and black people, and there is no, and whatever understanding we have of any kind of future of South Africa is inclusive of white people participating in it in order for it to be prosperous. So my ideas are not to the exclusion or to move white people to the periphery. In fact, we need them at the center of the reconciliation conversation, but we need people to sufficiently, everyone involved, to sufficiently hold themselves accountable for what they continue to benefit from apartheid and how they can make right with that.
That accountability, of course, applies to us as well, which is exactly, the point of my question. There are people who have behaved, most recently, in ways that actually cannot be justified. And if anything, they have let down the very people who have allowed them to occupy leadership positions in the hope that they will bring about a better life within their means, of course, or within the means of what is possible. And the truth of the matter is a lot of the people have actually let us down. So when we sit around the table, what are we specifically, or should we be prepared to concede as black people, yes, who have been wronged by apartheid? What are the things that we should be prepared to concede are the things that went wrong, for which we too should also take responsibility and accountability?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm going to answer this question, but I also don't want us to conflate the apartheid state with the current government.
No, we can't.
And sort of put their evils and weight them equally to each other. So, with that said, what I want to say is that our government hasn't done enough. It hasn't done enough around everything. And the mass corruption that we begin to see and we see every day, while ordinary South Africans are struggling, is completely inexcusable. And furthermore, our accountability measures in South Africa is one of the more transparent of the African countries, where we sit in commissions and we hear that people contribute to the deaths of 200 people, that 34 people died in one day, yet although there's transparency, there's no accountability. So nothing actually ever happens to people who show that they have no respect for South Africans, have no respect for this country. And so what we must concede is corruption. And we must concede that that has been how we have failed people, but also with accountability. Like there's absolutely no accountability structures, and everyone can do whatever it is they want, and we can sit in a commission and gasp at people's deaths, and no one is ever held accountable for that. And I think that's an untenable situation that we've allowed to occur. And these systems of unaccountability continue to just build up and accrue, and everyone knows that they can commit all kinds of corruption with impunity. So I think that's important, that we must concede that, and also that we don't necessarily have the best people in government. And our deployment strategies, which are party aligned most often, are not necessarily what's best for the country. And that's been a failure of the democratic South Africa. However, like I said earlier, we must not weight the failures of a democratic South Africa together with the wrath and really the poor and pernicious evil of apartheid. These two things happen at different times, and also they're not equally, you know what I mean. But you've conceded to this already. Okay.
That's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much for your time, Musa Gwebani, who is from the Social Justices Coalition. We also heard earlier Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance.